Let's see. Where should we begin? Maybe with a timeline? You don't really get UUs until 1961. Before then, you just get U's and U's. When the U's and the U's merged that year, then you get UUs. The Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, which, by the way, is an American organization. Each of those U's, of course, had its own earlier history. Start with the Unitarians. Unitarians can claim their ancestry all the way back to the turn of the 4th century, to Arius, a Christian, and so a follower of Jesus Christ, which moves our timeline back to 4 BC. Arius is famous for denying the dogma of the Trinity, which dogma, however, had not yet been defined. So, where did this dogma of the Trinity come from? Yes, the Gospels and letters of Paul use the term Father, Son, and Spirit loosely. Especially the Gospel of John sketches a dynamic relation of God to humankind, the hidden God manifest in Jesus, and by the Spirit gathering all to union with God. But a dogma that turns God into triplets? Where did that come from? You got it. The Emperor Constantine demanding uniformity of Christian belief in order to stabilize the empire. The other U, the Universalists, can claim their ancestry even further back to the turn of the 3rd century, to Origen, also a Christian, who preached universal salvation, which was okay, except that it meant you've heard of hell. Universal salvation means no hell. Origen, of course, caught hell for teaching that. But where did the idea of hell come from, anyway? It's not in the Old Testament, except a hint in the very late book of Daniel. The idea of hell as a place of everlasting punishment comes from Zoroastrianism, a religion from 6th century BC Persia, preached by Zarathustra. So Origen was reconnecting with a much longer tradition in which there is no hell. Moving right along in the history of the two U's, the Arian belief that God is one went underground, holding on mostly in Eastern Europe. An important turn of events occurred in the late 16th century in, of all places, Transylvania. There, under King John Sigismund, one David Farronc, a Lutheran bishop, preached what is called the first true Unitarian sermon, and partly through his preaching at the Diet of that Congress of Torda, the Edict of Torda was promulgated in 1569 as the first official declaration of religious freedom in Europe. And in 1571, Unitarianism was declared an official religion. There are several interesting Unitarian developments over the next 100 years, starting in Poland. In 1589, under Faustus Socinus, in the Synod of Brest, all Unitarians in Poland united. An interesting concept, United Unitarians. Within 100 years, the United Unitarians were driven out of Poland. Perhaps there's a lesson there? In 1666, the Unitarian refugees arrived in Amsterdam. By 1680, they were established in England. In 1689, the Toleration Act made England safe for nonconformist religion. Whew. Meanwhile, look at a few highlights of the other U's history, Universalism. In about 1600, the well-known German mystic Jakob Böhm had a vision negating eternal punishment. No hell. Theologically, all hell broke loose. Then in 1681, an English mystic, Jane Ward Leede, had a vision of universal restoration, influenced by Jakob Böhm, and she called her followers Christian Universalists. Okay, are you ready to cross the Atlantic? Now we're in America. In 1620, the first Pilgrim congregation was formed of people who meant to form a whole new life in the New World. By the way, that congregation became Unitarian in 1800 and still is Unitarian. But then came the Puritans, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, people who considered themselves refugees and anticipating return to a purified England, which didn't happen. These Puritans were not known for their tolerance of diversity. One Roger Williams, a Puritan elder, made the mistake of preaching tolerance and so was excommunicated. He fled and formed the colony of Rhode Island, which established religious freedom by law in 1647. In New England, some congregational churches stressed God's benevolence and human freedom. When the Great Awakening came in the 1730s, these churches stressed God's benevolence and human freedom even more. Conservatives tried to insult them by calling them Unitarians. The term stuck. There are some important people from the 18th century you should at least be introduced to. In 1770, John Murray, who had become a Universalist in 1760, emigrated to America. Within 10 years, he formed the Independent Church of Christ Universalist in Gloucester, Massachusetts. In 1788, he married Judith Sargent, perhaps the first advocate for women's rights, and a writer. In 1793, Reverend Murray was called as minister to the First Universalist Church in Boston. In 1794, Joseph Priestley emigrated to America. Priestley was a scientist as well as theologian and preacher, and he sought to integrate Enlightenment rationalism and Christian faith. The following year, he dedicated the first Unitarian church in Philadelphia. In the same year that Priestley emigrated to America, Hosea Ballou was ordained at the Second Universalist General Assembly. He went on to serve Universalist churches in New England, and his Treatise on Atonement was the go-to book for Universalist theology. Ballou was also a Unitarian. A proto-UU? In 1803, the New England Convention of Universalists adopted the Winchester Profession of Faith, affirming the Bible, good works, and universal salvation. In 1819, William Ellery Channing gave his pivotal sermon, Unitarian Christianity, essentially establishing a new denomination. Meanwhile, up in New England, the tension in congregational churches had continued ever since the Great Awakening. In 1820, things came to a head in Dedham, Massachusetts, when conservative church members and more liberal parish members fought over a new minister candidate. The liberals won the election. The conservatives split with the church assets. The liberals sued, and in 1820, the Massachusetts court awarded the church assets to the liberals. The result? The Dedham Unitarian Church, now a UU church. In 1825, the American Unitarian Association was founded, giving the new denomination a national identity and publishing a new theology. The Unitarian movement remained very Christian well into the 19th century, but a new phase was developing. Dramatized in Ralph Waldo Emerson's 1838 Harvard sermon on transcendentalism, this sermon was like an early humanist manifesto, and it got Emerson denounced as an atheist and a poisoner of young men's minds. But a movement formed around Emerson called Transcendentalism that included Margaret Fuller, author and women's rights activist, and Henry David Thoreau, poet and philosopher. In 1841, Theodore Parker, a Unitarian minister, transcendentalist, and abolitionist, preached a sermon that affirmed the ethical nature of Christianity and denied the validity of Bible and dogma, another step closer to humanism. Through the rest of the 19th century, especially in response to the freeing of slaves and the horrors of the Civil War, Unitarians and Universalists sought social justice through anti-slavery, women's rights, education, and social reform. Prominent among them were Clara Barton, a nurse who started the American Red Cross, and Dorothea Dix, a teacher and reformer of prisons and advocate for the mentally ill. In 1894, the Unitarian National Conference agreed that this U is an ethically based, non-creedal religion. In 1895, the Universalist General Convention nixed a proposal for Unitarian Universalist cooperation. But hey, this shows people were thinking that direction way back then. Into the 20th century, the First World War made people rethink a lot. In 1917, the Universalist Declaration of Social Principles identified unjust social and economic conditions as the root of evil, and so the task of religion is to address those conditions. Building from 19th century transcendentalists, Unitarians moved toward a more humanist-based religion. In 1933, Unitarian ministers Curtis Reese and John Dietrich led a diverse group of intellectual leaders to a consensus statement, the Humanist Manifesto. In the turbulent years of the Great Depression and World War II, with the shift of population from rural to urban, one U grew, and the other U didn't. The U's and the U's flirted with the idea of merger in 1931 and in 1947, but merger discussion got serious in the late 1950s. Then, In 1961, we get UUs. The Unitarian Universalist Association was formed. Its first president, Dana McLean Greeley, just in time for the 60s, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement. By the way, it was UUA's Beacon Press that published the Pentagon Papers in 1972, helping to end the Vietnam War. Unitarian Universalism continued to push for racial, gender, and cultural diversity throughout the remainder of the 20th century, for equality for women, for women's rights, for the rights of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people, and for marriage equality. The UUA established the Welcoming Congregation Program to encourage UU congregations to invite and embrace lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people into our congregations. As we move into the 21st century, UUs welcome all to a faith based on tolerance, inclusiveness, reason, and universal love. And that's the UU story.